Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great privilege to welcome Professor Roger Trigg this morning. Professor Trigg is the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from Warwick University, although he's now moved to what we call here the other place, to Oxford University, and he's there a Senior Research Fellow in the Faculty of Theology, leading up a very fascinating research program there in cognitive psychology. I don't know if Roger will have time to tell us anything about that. Professor Trigg's had a very distinguished career in philosophy. All the details are in the biographies before you. He's chaired many committees. He's been president of the British Society for Philosophy of Religion, and indeed many other philosophical societies. And he's also been quite heavily involved in examining philosophical theses here in Cambridge, so he's a frequent visitor to Cambridge. He's also written a lot of books, and I know we've got some of those books on the bookstore. I really recommend those, Rationality and Science and so on. I do recommend those. I found them extremely helpful, and I have to say my own thinking has been very much influenced by what Professor Trigg has been writing. And so today he's going to give us a sort of broad introduction about rationality and religion under this title, Can Religion Be as Rational as Science? Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Dennis. It's a privilege to be here again. I do apologise in a way for not using PowerPoint, but it isn't altogether my inability to use technological things. It's also because it's very difficult to illustrate philosophy. I can show you pictures of philosophers, and it reminds me once of a sort of program in the 1960s where they were talking about the Lord Privy Seal, and they showed you a picture of a lord, a picture of an outside privy, and a picture of a seal. And it gets a bit like that when you're trying to illustrate philosophy. I'm afraid I'm dealing with rather abstract ideas, which is why I won't talk for hours and hours, because I do want the discussion. Philosophy thrives on dialogue. Since the time of Socrates, it's been a subject where, in fact, people learn through discussion, not through me telling you what the truth is. Now that brings me neatly into what I really want to talk about, which is the importance of truth. Because, in fact, although I may not be able to tell you what the truth is, I do very firmly believe that truth matters. That, in fact, without the idea of truth, it's like playing soccer without goalposts, cricket without a wicket. There's no point to what you're doing. You take away everything from science, philosophy, anything. And, some people think, well, philosophers have been arguing about the same things for 2.5 millennia and they haven't got anywhere near agreement, so it shows the whole thing's a waste of time. Philosophy is just making simple things seem difficult. I don't believe that. I think what we're doing are things that each generation have to wrestle with themselves. They're to do with the human condition, to do with our place in the world. And what I really want to talk about this morning are two things which, in fact, Plato talked about. And I'm on Plato's side in both, actually. He was against relativism and he was against materialism. And both, in modern guises, are alive and living in Oxford and Cambridge today. So, first of all, can I just begin by talking about relativism? Now, Dennis mentioned some of my books. I wrote a book back in 1973, published by Cambridge University Press, on reason and commitment. For some reason, the Polish translation did very well. And I always kept on meeting Poles who read the book in Polish. And I wondered why, and I thought, well, perhaps one reason was that in communist Poland, the idea that actually one's commitment should be rationally based, that one should be thinking rationally about what's true, was actually quite an explosive idea. In other words, reason is an antidote to the blind use of power, and that's, I think, a very important thought. But one of the basic themes of that book on reason and commitment was the pernicious effect of relativism in both science and religion. It was showing just at the beginning, I suppose, in the 1960s and 70s, I'm very disappointed that since then relativism has gone from strength to strength, and I didn't manage to kill it off. But I at least identified a cultural trend, though I couldn't control it. Just to show how great a cultural trend it is, I just want to give you a couple of quotations here from two very different sources. And I gave a couple of isms just now. I mean, linked with those isms is the ism of postmodernism, which I want to talk about as well, which is relativist as well. And you're liable to come across that even on the Today programme on Radio 4. I mean, it's permeated everywhere. Let me just read, though, a few passages from this glossy publication from the American Anglican Council. The word Anglican is deeply significant. They're not Episcopal. They have deep differences with the American Episcopal Church. And here we're really at the fault line of present difficulties in the Anglican Communion worldwide. Can I just read this? As the Episcopal Church in the United States continues to wrestle with the repercussions of the Windsor Report, I, says the writer, am frequently asked, and he's the Bishop of South Carolina, why can't we just agree to disagree? Why can't we just get along? The assumption is that the issues are simply differing points of view that we should accept, because in this world there are always different points of view. The reality is that we're experiencing a collision of two contradictory and irreconcilable worldviews. Gospel theology is in conflict with the postmodern philosophies of relativism and individualism. And later down on the same page he says that the philosophy of self and relativism has penetrated the church. Now, I think actually that this ties up with Alan's closing remarks this morning when he talked about, and he quoted the Bishop of Rochester, talking about the loss of nerve in the church at the moment. I think the adoption of relativism, consciously or unconsciously, is a sign of that loss of nerve. In other words, people are no longer willing to say, this is true, or even more humbly, I believe this is true, even if we're mistaken, I think this is the truth as I can best see it. They go back to say, well, I don't think there's anything that's really true. It's true as it appears to me, true as it appears to you. Different truth for different people. And of course that's wonderfully tolerant in an age where different religions are trying to get along, so that what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. We don't actually have to disagree at all. But of course the penalty is saying that actually there is no such thing as truth. This document attacks bitterly what it calls the revisionism a lot of American Anglican theology. One point it says that of course the liturgy is the same, but the meaning given to the words becomes completely different. And I think that what goes on really is that there is a kind of relativism coming in here, very often a relativism of time, that, oh well, of course we live in the modern age, a scientific age, we understand this. Of course in New Testament times that was a pre-industrial, pre-scientific age. What was true for them was true for them, but it can't be true for us. There can be no carryover. I mean, to take an obvious example, I mean, obviously we know there isn't such a thing as a virgin birth. Luke may have believed it when he was writing Silio. Luke, he didn't know how babies were conceived. After all, he was only a Greek doctor. What did they know? Well, I mean, you see, actually, when you start to look at things, you begin to realise that things aren't quite as simple as that. And the very fact I quoted Plato at the beginning, as worried about relativism and materialism 2,500 years ago, is itself a disproof of relativism, because I understand his worries, his philosophical worries, from a different milieu, an absolutely different culture. And yet I can understand the reasoning processes that he was going through and what worried him about the culture of his day and the cultural pressures of his day. I can see the same thing now. And that shows that actually human nature has not changed. I don't think reality has changed either. So our human predicament, we as humans facing the reality we do, is basically the same now as it was then. That things have not changed that much. So relativism is itself well, not just questionable, it's incoherent, because we actually, if you pursue relativism, you could never understand people of different cultures, you could never understand people of different epochs. They would be in their own hermetically sealed boxes, and we would have no way in. We would understand them in our terms, but not theirs, and I don't think that's the case at all. Now, in talking about the sad difficulties of the American Episcopal Church, you might think, oh, well, I'm just looking again at a particular area of the Christian Church, well, that's what you get when you get some evangelicals getting hot under the collar. Although, I think it is very significant to see that they themselves are identifying the problem as not being about homosexuality, which the newspapers would have us believe, but about something far deeper. But if you have any doubts about the global relevance of the issue that I'm talking about, particularly for religion, let me quote this from Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict. In his book, Truth and Tolerance, he talks of how today many people believe that the multiplicity of cultures serves to demonstrate the relativism of all cultures, so that culture is set against truth. And he goes on, this relativism, which is nowadays to be found as a basic attitude of enlightened people, penetrating far into the realm of theology, so he's obviously getting it in the Roman Catholic Church as well, as one can see. He says this is the most profound difficulty of our age. Now just think for a moment, the Pope is actually saying that the problem of relativism is the most profound difficulty of our age. Now that's actually quite a big statement when you look at the state of the world and you look at what's going on in it. And he's identifying a basic philosophical attitude as underlying, presumably, a lot of the evils that he sees. And one spin-off, for instance, is that with this presumption, he says, mission becomes the mere presumptuous attitude of a culture that imagines itself to be superior. And indeed, the kind of post-imperialist guilt that you still find in this country tends to spread to the idea that, well, of course, Christianity isn't actually true, because that's to impose our views on other people. And so again, one gets subtracting from the nature of truth. And if you do that to religion, then I think one is in deep trouble. What's the point of the religion? Ratzinger goes on to say that the unity of the human condition and its common experience of contact with a truth that is greater than we are, that is what we should be concentrating on. The unity of the human condition, a truth greater than we are. Human nature and objective reality. Dennis mentioned at the beginning that I'm now involved in a big new research project that we have had funded in Oxford on the cognitive study of religion, the anthropological roots of religion. And it's in its early days, but basically the issue is religion natural, or religious impulse natural in human beings? Now, of course, what are the theological implications of, or the philosophical implications of that? That's a further issue. But, again, this ties in with things that have already been said. If it is natural, then one's dealing with something very deep-rooted and important in the human condition that can't be just simply swept aside. It has to be taken account of in a very real sense. Now, postmodernism is, I suppose, the most obvious form of relativism in our present society. Though relativism is in every thought that you talk to the average first-year philosophy student about morality, and they just take for granted that there's no such thing as moral truth, that everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else, and no one has a right to say, but that's wrong, or that's harmful, or it may be harmful for you. Well, that's just your opinion. And indeed, one of the problems about relativism is just how it's to be defined. I suppose, very briefly, I'd say relativism is the doctrine that it's true that there's no such thing as truth. That's meant to be contradictory, and it is contradictory. As I said, Plato attacked relativism, and that was one of his arguments, that relativism is incoherent. And if you believe it, you certainly can't teach anything anymore. He attacked Protagoras for teaching relativism. There's no such thing as a truth to be portrayed as such. But despite the incoherence of relativism, if one just goes on along for a moment and starts to say, well, what's meant by relativism? Somehow truth is being related to the fact of it being judged true. It's a bit like saying beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but that's a very subjective thing, and I think sometimes relativism becomes subjective. It just breaks down to each individual making their own judgments. But more often, it's a community, a group, a society. And the issue is, well, how do you define that community, that group, that society? If you say truth is relative to what we think, who are we? One well-known relativist, Richard Rorty, who died not so long ago, was a typical kind of East Coast American liberal philosopher, and he would, in fact, say, well, more or less truth is what we think. Science is right because we think it. Not a very reassuring view, I think, if you want to do science, because why do science? And this is where postmodernism begins to not only undermine religion, but it undermines science as well. Because if religion is just what we do, whoever we are and however we are to be defined, science is also just what we do, whoever we are. And if other people don't do science but prefer astrology, well, who are we to say they're wrong? Because we can't. It's not what we do. And it's a fair point, I think, to people like Richard Rorty to say, well, who is this we? American East Coast intellectuals? Very often the things that he says we believe don't seem to stretch very far into the United States, not as far as the Midwest anyway. So it's not at all clear there what in fact he is saying. One of the things he is doing is reacting against what he terms the Enlightenment view of modernity. And I think I can see why people get worried about that. I'm not going to launch into a great historical survey of the Enlightenment at the moment, but just to point out that there are various stages in it. The Enlightenment in the 18th century was a movement that exalted the power and the potentiality of human reason. People like Kant at the end of the century, I suppose, were exponents of it, and linked the word enlightenment with notions of improvement, of the growth of knowledge, of progress. It led into the great 19th century idea that science was going to give us greater knowledge, which meant greater progress. A bit like Socrates' idea that virtue is knowledge. Knowledge is virtue. Said the Enlightenment people, if you know it, we're going to get better. And as has already been pointed out this morning, the history of the 20th century rather explodes that view. Just because we can kill more people more efficiently doesn't mean we're better. Nevertheless, in the end, if you look at the growth of science in the 18th century, you can see that it became more and more materialist. And this brings me on to the second prong of what I want to talk about particularly, which is the notion of materialism. And the tension between relativism and materialism. I mentioned Rorty because it seems to me he wants to be both at once, both a relativist and a materialist, or in modern philosophical parlance, perhaps a naturalist, somebody who believes that all there is what is natural, what the natural sciences tell us, or a physicalist, what there is what physics tells us, and everything reduces to physics. In the end, it comes down to the same thing, that it's science that is the arbiter of what there is. And this is certainly a late Enlightenment view, that reason is to be defined in terms of what science can do. What is outside the reach of science is, in fact, in the end, therefore something to be dismissed. Now, I said that this is the later Enlightenment view because I firmly myself believe in reason. I talked about the poles at the beginning, saying that reason was something to oppose the force, and that reason is probably something that in the end is actually more powerful even than Russian tanks. But what reason? Not a circumscribed reason that already tells you what the answer has to be, because actually reality is only what science tells us. That's already to take up a certain philosophical and metaphysical position. It's already the product of reasoning. It shouldn't be the start of our rational process. And if you go back into the 17th century, not the 18th, when people were beginning to talk about the importance of reason, and not coincidentally, we had the beginnings of modern science, particularly here in Cambridge, with people like Newton, and then the founding of the Royal Society. If you look at the philosophical and metaphysical surround of that, you can see that there was a strong belief in reason, but not this circumscribed reason of the French materialists in particular, who felt that really rationalism was a synonym for atheism. And notice in our language, rationalism can be a synonym for atheism, and yet there's no reason why that should be so. Rationalism ought to be something that extols human reason. But very often it becomes the extolling of human reason at the expense of anything transcendent or at the expense of any revelation. Again, it's a circumscribed, narrow notion of reason. Now, in Cambridge, in the 17th century, there were some of my favourite philosophers and theologians, the Cambridge Platonists. Some of them are immortalised in the stained glass in Emmanuel College down the road. They were associated with Emmanuel particularly. People like Benjamin Whichcote, who became Provost of Kings. People like Peter Sterry, who was chaplain to Cromwell. And they were people who emphasised the importance of reason. They influenced Newton and people like him. And in fact, they influenced the philosopher John Locke, who is in a sense the patron saint of liberal politics, who was quoted very much in the 18th century in the American War of Independence. But this was a freedom that was rooted in religious belief. It was a reason that was rooted in a belief in God that was not opposed to it. So in the stained glass, in Emmanuel, you have one of their slogans written up above Benjamin Whichcote: "Reason is the candle of the Lord." It's a quotation from Proverbs. But there, you see, you have a notion of reason that's very different from the notion of reason that became current later on, a narrow, constricted notion that reason is to do with science. It's a wider notion that involves a strong belief in the capability of human reason, but as a reflection of the reason of God. We heard last night that science is God's science. And the reason why humans perhaps are able to think God's thoughts after him sometimes is because they share, in a very small way, the reason of the Creator. Notice that phrase, reason is the candle of the Lord. Just think back to the days before there was electricity, before we had powerful electric lights. You've only got to look at a period production of Jane Austen in The Flickering Candlelight to see that candlelight casts a pale light, a flickering light. It casts as many shadows as it illuminates. So the candle of the Lord is something that casts light, but it doesn't tell us everything, and it doesn't show us everything. It reminds us of what we don't know as well as of what we do. So in that short phrase is both the affirmation that reason is rooted in God and religious belief, and also the warning that we don't know everything, and perhaps we can't know everything. In the 18th century, as I've said, particularly in France, reason became aggressively much more materialistic, and that notion has lived on. Each of the speakers so far has mentioned Richard Dawkins. I will be no different. He epitomizes, I suppose, this 18th century view of reason. It's also a view in which, in a sense, I was brought up with philosophically, because I was in New College in the 1960s when A.J. Ayer was there, And he was at that time the great apostle of British atheism. He was the exponent in this country of logical positivism in his classic Language, Truth and Logic. He believed that in fact what can't be verified scientifically is meaningless. What can't be falsified scientifically, therefore, is of no account. Anything like that, any religious utterances, can't gain any kind of application at all. You might just as well be saying "ooga boo bonk" as God exists, or the Lord is my Redeemer, or anything that might be meaningful to people. No, it's just like the crackling of flames under a pot, to use another analogy from a Greek philosopher. It's nothing. And he firmly pushed this line. Now I'm just emphasising that because actually, if you read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, insofar as there's any philosophy in the book, and he knows, I was going to say about as much philosophy as I know biology, but I do know a bit about the theory of biology, so I think he knows less philosophy than biology. But anyway, he actually there, insofar as there's anything, it's an implicit logical positivism. It's the philosophy of his youth. It's a rather dispiriting fact that you find that people tend to stick with the ideas they were given when they were about 20 or so, and that's what they go by. And here he is in his 60s, putting forward the platitudes of Oxford philosophy of the early 1960s, which is basically reason is scientific reason, evidence is what is given us by science. So when he says things like, there is no evidence that X, Y, Z, what he means is science can't tell us. And of course, if it's something that science can't tell us about, that's no great news. But for him, he has defined reality, defined truth in these narrow observational terms. What can't be observed, what can't be measured, can't in fact be discovered to be true. When I was an undergraduate, actually, I mean, this did create problems for logical positivists, because at the time no one had seen the other side of the moon. And there was a question, therefore, whether the moon had another side. Now, you might think that was a bit peculiar. But, I mean, if you were really kind of card-carrying logical positivist, if something hasn't been observed and is only theoretical, there is an issue there. I mean, it's why, of course, logical positivism doesn't work for science, because it doesn't work for theoretical entities in physics. So actually, physics itself disproves, I think, logical positivism. And philosophers like Quine emphasised the very great role of theory in science. So there are all kinds of internal problems, I think, one can, even from the point of view of science, that one can, in fact, bring up to bear against logical positivism. But ultimately, in the end, you got this question about reality and perception. And, well, eventually, people did see the other side of the moon, and people like Ayer said, well, but in principle it's observable. But in principle, a lot of things are observable. I suppose you could, in principle, observe the other side of the universe, but nobody like us will ever get there. I suppose, in principle, you could get inside a black hole. But I mean, it depends by principle. I mean, if it's theoretical, then perhaps... so the notion of, in principle, being able to observe something gets very, very attenuated. And in the end, I think that the only way to deal with it is by talking about reality, on the one hand, and our knowledge of it on another. And the minute you separate those two things, you have to accept that perhaps there may be parts of reality we can't know about. And whether it's physical or beyond the physical world. And once you, of course, accept that, then you're going to be much more open-minded about certain things that are going to be possibly discussed. Anyway, as I'm saying, the new atheism, and people like Dawkins exemplify it, wish to restrict rationality. And therefore they're attacking the idea of religion and leaving little place for it. Relativism, on the other hand, seems to allow place for religion. Now, postmodernism, from that point of view, has been welcomed by some theologians because they think, this gets us out of the grip of science. Because we don't have to present our credentials to science, because if it's true for us and it's true according to the standards of religion, it doesn't matter that the scientists don't bother about it because it's not scientific anyway. But that's, we know that. So it's true in religious terms and not in scientific terms. That, of course, as I said, it becomes a kind of relativism, and only the relativism then is relative to religion, I suppose, rather than relative to science. But it begins to split up human knowledge in a dangerous way. Indeed, it makes human knowledge impossible, because there is nothing to know. All that we have is a situation where you have different groups of people behaving in different ways. So you have religious people involved in funny practices, and you have scientists in white coats involved in funny practices. And some do one thing, some do another. And that's it. Other people play golf. So, I mean, there's no point in doing, or no truth behind it. Actually, in the whole field of science and religion, it's surprising how many people are quite eager to take that gambit and say that religion and science are different forms of life, different language games, those are terms of Wittgenstein. Or, on the other hand, they're different traditions, they're different this, they're different that. They ask different questions. Now, of course, to some extent, science and religion do. Last night we were told that science asks questions how, religion asks questions why. I'm sure there's a lot of truth in that. But it might suggest that if you're not careful, science deals with the facts and religion deals with our reactions to the facts. So that science deals with what's true and religion deals with values. Now that gets us back to logical positivism, because the fact-value distinction was absolutely central in logical positivism, and it invariably involved, in fact, raising the status of facts and downgrading the status of values. So values are what people have. It's an interesting fact about them, but not about the world. Facts are about the world. Now, if religion is about anything, any religion, it must be about the world. In other words, it must be making statements that purport to be true about the world. If we firmly believe that this is God's world, then religion has as much claim to make rational claims about the world and our place in it as does science. Now, it may be, of course, at that point that you may begin to get clashes or purported clashes. And I think that I'm quite willing to accept that, therefore, there may be things that religion and science have to discuss. It may be that religion is overreaching itself and making claims it shouldn't be. It may be science is ruling out whole facets of human experience it shouldn't. The logical positivists were very good at ruling out just about everything. They, coming from originally the Vienna Circle, emphasized the scientific world conception. Very chilling notion, actually. It was put forward before the world of concentration camps, but you can imagine the scientific world conception would do rather well in a concentration camp. And it deals with technology, with science, but values, beauty, goodness, even truth, they're all swept aside as being, in fact, of subjective value only, really of no account. Now, I think that that is a deep mistake, and I think, for instance, if one is religious, one believes that value, I'm not very keen on that word, but morality, moral standards are built into the fabric of the world. We were talking earlier about Aristotle and about his influence. One of the things that both Plato and Aristotle believed was that, of course, morality and the world weren't to be separated. The nature of the world was linked very much with what's good for us, what's bad for us. Human nature is a fact, but what's good for human nature, what answers our interests, is very much not just a matter of our subjective valuing, but a matter of truth about how, in fact, we can live in the world properly, how humans can flourish. There's a notion of natural law there that comes back to Aristotle, but I think is still relevant today. But that's, if it is relevant, is an issue about truth. So morality, I think, is still concerned with issues about truth. Now the trouble about materialism, again, is that it, as I said, wants to sweep everything that it can't account for out. Typically, it sweeps human experience out of account. And I don't just mean our experience of value, I just mean the fact of human experience. Because what is consciousness? How, in fact, to experience the world? I mean, as I'm looking round at you now and the sun's shining on you, I can see a lot of red badge things and, I mean, things like that. I can see colours. All of that can't be explained by physicists. I mean, they can show the underlying brain patterns and you can go down to neurophysiology and in the end down to physics. And that's reductionism. But in so doing, you're changing the subject completely. There are plenty of philosophers out there who don't mind changing the subject, and they say, well, the rest is just folk psychology. But folk psychology is our experience of the world. It's how we live. It's rather important to us as humans. So it isn't, in fact, something to be dismissed. Yet materialism, physicalism, naturalism do, because science actually can't take proper account of it. Indeed, of course, science itself depends on the notion of human experience, and indeed empiricism writes that in as the basis of all investigation. So if you, in a sense, reduce experience to something else, you're beginning to kick away the very foundations of the ability to theorize that you started out with. Now, I think that, as I've said, religion assumes the notion of truth. And incidentally, I've talked about religion, but not all religion is the same. And I suppose an implication of what I'm saying, and it's one that a lot of people don't like, is that some religion is false. It doesn't follow that some religion is true, of course, it might all be false, but nevertheless it can't all be true. A relativist likes an easy life, a relativist likes to say, you know, everything's true for those who believe it, and so we could. But actually, you find a relativist and you start saying, does that mean that if you come across some kind of religion that believes in human sacrifice, let's say the sacrifice of children, is that all right for them? And they might find that they're not very willing to say because it's religious and that's what they believe and it's true for them, therefore they should be able to do it. And once you begin to say that kind of thing, then you can realize that perhaps some beliefs that masquerade as religious are rather evil and certainly can't be tolerated in a civilized society, and that, I would have said, are false. They have false beliefs about human beings and indeed what's good for human beings. So I think that one has to accept that notions of truth can in fact be divisive, and that's why of course some people don't like them. I think against that should be put the idea that actually, if you, let's go back to the notion of the candle of the Lord, if you really believe in truth, it's a completely further step to believe that I have it or you have it. Truth is something far greater than any of us, and actually it should induce a kind of humility and a willingness to learn. Indeed, it's a belief in the nature of truth that is the motive for science and the motive behind any idea of scientific progress. It's because we don't know, and we want to know more, that science has a point. And you might say the same about religion. But, and then of course the interesting thing is, well, just how much can we claim we do know about religion? But certainly, I think that the idea that all religion is the same, and all religion is to be equally valued, which you find that almost getting to that point in some legal systems. Therefore, I think that that's a very dangerous thing. So the conduct of science, the practice of religion, assumes there is a truth to be discovered, not a truth to be constructed. Now you might say, well, whoever thought that in science people constructed truth? Of course, the whole nature of science assumes truth, religion may not. But actually, truth in science is itself under attack and has been for quite a number of years. Even in Cambridge, in the philosophy of science, there's been quite a school of what you might call social constructivism, that scientific theory is a construction of the society of which we're a part. It isn't a process of discovery, it's a process of construction. So that's actually deeply, I think, corrosive of any idea of science, links with postmodernism and the idea of science as a tradition. But it begins to eat away at any idea that science is discovering the world. It's just building pictures of the world, our pictures of the world. And therefore you could have a sociology of science which would explain why it is that science becomes the kind of thing it is. So sociologists can take over and say, we can know what's going on, rather than scientists saying we're discovering the truth. Sociologists will say, no, we can tell you the social conditions which give rise to this kind of belief. And another lot of sociologists can come along and say, and we can tell you why you sociologists of science think the way you do. And then you're in an infinite regress. You're back and back and back. And that just shows, again, the incoherence of any kind of relativism which takes away truth as a target. You're always going to get that infinite regress. That, all right, I say, well, your truth is just true for you. And they would then say, and again, this is Plato's argument, well, that means, therefore, that you're saying that it's true for you that that's only true for me. And somebody else would say, well, it's true for me that it's true for him that it's true for you. And somebody would say, yeah, but it's only just true for him. And so it goes on and on. There's never an assertion of truth. It's always related to a person's belief. And why believe if the reason it's true is that I believe it? Well, there's no point. Why keep on believing? And this goes back to the Pope's point that Christian mission is taken away from us, the possibility of mission. Some people might say, well, a good thing too, but I mean, that says something about our society, that truth no longer matters. But what then does matter? Because reason doesn't matter, because reason has no target. So we can't, I mean, I think the point is when people disagree, we should talk about it rationally and come to a rational conclusion about how we should live together. But nevertheless, in the end, without the possibility of reason, we're back to the operation of power, back to the Russian tanks, because there is no other alternative. Going back to the Cambridge Platonists, it wasn't a coincidence that in the 17th century they suddenly said reason is so important. Because just think of the period they'd lived through. A period of great disruption in this country, a terrible civil war, a period of wars really based partly at any rate on religion, and they thought that the way to get away from that was to operate in a reasonable way through the process of reason. Without the ability to do that, of course, you're back with the only ability to influence other people is by using force. And actually that's why I think the relativists, so far from being tolerant, is opening the way for violence. Now that's a kind of nice global statement, but if you don't get anywhere through reasoning, and most of us like other people to agree with us, then I can get you to agree with me by clobbering you or threatening to clobber you. The Russian tank syndrome again. Reason, though, shows us another path. I think that the great mistake of people in the 18th century was to narrow this idea of reason too much, as I've said, so that actually what matters to most people in life suddenly gets outside its purview. Religion, ethics, aesthetics, even politics. Somehow all of these things aren't a matter for reason because only science is a matter for reason. Now, of course, in the 18th and 19th centuries, people felt that didn't matter because they thought science could give us the answers. But when they find that science can't give us the answers, if, in fact, that is the only way we can operate with reason, it's not surprising from a cultural point of view that people turn to a postmodernist attack on the very idea of reason, because reason itself seems impotent. I think the way is to widen the idea of reason much more. So I don't think that either science or religion should be in a ghetto. I think that they should talk to each other. I can't expand on this very much at the moment, but I just want to emphasize that I think actually science itself does need religion as much as religion needs science. Because, in fact, there is an issue about why the world is comprehensible. Again, that's been mentioned so far in this conference. And also, why is it orderly? Why is it that the world behaves in a way which, sure enough, we can live in, but why can we assume that scientific theory, if it's discovered in Cambridge, can apply in Beijing, that what's discovered in New York applies in New Delhi, and so on? Why do we assume that what is valid here is valid there, what is valid now is valid then? I mean, in philosophical terms, this is the problem of induction. Hume, without theistic underpinnings, gave up on it, really. He said, oh, we just expect things to be the same. But actually, I think that if you believe in a God who created the world, you have every rational ground for assuming consistency and a rational order in things. So that actually, science is made possible by religious belief. From a historical point of view, I think you could argue that that was in fact the case. And without it, it begins to founder. People like Richard Dawkins are trying to carry on with the old-fashioned positivism. And incidentally, of course, Dawkins would be as opposed to relativism and postmodernism as I would be. But, of course, in the end, he's trying to stand by a narrow view of science, and I think that itself is not tenable. I'll just close by just saying that there are, of course, apart from intellectual issues about religion being as rational as science, and everything I've said suggests that actually, because both are about the same kind of reality, about God's world, and we're using the same human reason, unless you restrict what's to count as real and what's to count as evidence, reason can and should be as rational as science. Once you accept that, you should accept the fact that it has every right to be in the public world and as a matter of public discourse. Now again, under the influence largely of old-fashioned positivism, there's quite a move in modern political circles to make religion a private matter, in a sense to privatize religion. So that, yes, religion is up to the individual. You can see how this works from a relativist point of view. And yes, I mean, we believe in religious freedom, and therefore people should do what they want, but that it shouldn't be allowed in the public sphere, it shouldn't be allowed in the public square. This is a thing that's been exercising me a lot recently. My latest book was on religion in public life. But part of the point is that religion is being pushed into the private sphere, partly in comparison with science, which is thought to be, above all, the arbiter of what should be in the public sphere, because I suppose the idea is we can reconcile our differences scientifically, at least in principle. You can't with a religion. Religion is divisive. Science perhaps isn't. Then that's a nice old-fashioned Enlightenment view. It's perhaps a little bit optimistic about science sometimes. But if you believe that religion has as much right to talk about reason as science has, and of course this is going against any idea that religion is just a matter of faith and not reason. I mean, that's implicit in everything I've said. If you believe that religion is about reason as much as science is, then we can discuss it together in public as well as anybody else. I suppose that is that one thing that perhaps Dawkins is willing to do, although he's only willing to discuss it in public to sweep it aside. I don't think he's willing really to engage in any rational discussion about religion. But insofar as religion is discussed nowadays in a public arena, I think that can only be a good thing. And I firmly believe that it's not, in principle, going to come off worse against science. Well, as I said, I'd like to hear what you think about all of this, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Roger. Good. Well, we've got a good time now for discussion. Thanks to Alan as he goes to the next lecture. So, and over to you for the philosophers and others to ask questions.
You don't have to be a philosopher to ask a
No,
question.
you don't. Yes, yes.
I'm just wondering about your comment on the application of postmodern ideas on very practical modern day life, like in the everyday of systemic psychotherapy, which is based on, and family therapy is based on postmodern ideas. There is no truth and multiple truth, which works very well. I mean, not trying to see that somebody is abused and this causes depression. We kind of having a kind of multiple views, holding not a non-judgmental position and allowing truth to happen, which is multiple truth and multiple narratives. That works very well in day-to-day practice. And what would be your comment about that?
Well, I don't quite understand what you're saying, because you're saying it works very well, so I suppose it's true that it works well. So we're talking about truth at some level, and when you talk about multiple truths, well, there are multiple truths, so I suppose it's true there are multiple truths. I think if you really consistently get rid of the idea of truth, you can't even talk in a public arena. So if you get back down to the particular discipline and then talking about you're saying, well, one shouldn't be judgmental. But if there's no truth, well, I mean, what are you doing? I mean, I don't understand what the purpose of it is. If there's, I mean, you see, you did say it works better, so you've got some idea of something being better than something else.
Well, what I mean to say is just not one cause of something is happening in the modern world. It's kind of multiplicity of things.
But then that's true. I mean, nothing I said suggests that there only has to be one cause. There can be lots of causes. But there are lots of causes. It isn't that it's true for me that there are some causes and true for somebody else that there are others. There are causes, some operating in some situations, some in others. But that's different from saying, well, I mean, otherwise you could get one psychotherapist saying one thing and another the next day saying the opposite, and to the same person, that's a cause, and then the next one would say, well, no, it isn't. I mean, I just don't understand actually what's going on. Again, you see, non-judgmental. I'm always worried when people say they're non-judgmental. I mean, particularly in the field of morality, because in the end it just means anything goes. And a scientist would never say they were non-judgmental. I mean, can you imagine a kind of astrophysicist saying, I'm non-judgmental about astrology? I mean, let them do it. I mean, so I wonder, I mean, how far is what you're doing scientific if you're not judgmental? I mean, obviously you're treating people sympathetically, seeing it from their point of view, looking at it from their perspective, etc. But if there's no idea of better or worse, of your doing of an end state that's better than the one they started with, or a method that's going to be more effective than another, then how do you earn your money? And that's actually Plato's question to Prof, who was taking much the same line and yet was earning money teaching. So what's going on, you see? You must think you've got something to impart, or a method, or you're helping in some way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I agree with the idea that there has to be some solid understanding and rationale behind what is going on.
Yes.
But when coming from my background and experience, when we kind of, I will use the term non-judgmental, that gives me a position of not being biased by my own ideas and thoughts and my background even, and cultural, social background. And unless I've been kind of holding the position on non-judgmentality, I'm just judging the person in one kind of single truth. And that can become actually a problematic for the person itself.
Yes, but it's quite right that you should see things from their point of view. You shouldn't impose your own particular views on what you're doing. And that's, part of the process. But at the same time, you must have some idea that there are better and worse states, that there's something you're trying to improve. You've got some notion of improvement. You're not going to accept their idea of what counts as improvement, are you? Again, unless you've got something to offer them to help. Obviously they've got to feel better at the end of it, and that's part of the process. But what I'm trying to say is I don't think that everything is subjective. In the end, there's some body of knowledge. But obviously you've got to be sensitive. Relativism is a very important part of anthropology. I think it undermines the discipline. But there's something right about it, and that it gets confused with relativism. And that's that if you go to another culture, there aren't many untouched now by Western, they're all watching satellite television. But in the days when you could go and observe another culture, it was a great mistake to assume that they were all just behaving as people who were going to be back home. You had to, the point of doing fieldwork was to see things through their eyes. But that didn't mean that you just went native. I have read stories of people, anthropologists who've gone and just joined the cannibals. But, you don't. In fact, the whole point about anthropology is taking your society with you and seeing it from their point of view, but then comparing. If you just go native and join the other society, there's no notion of comparison. So there is something scientific going on. You're trying to find points of contact, but you won't find them if you just think they're behaving like people in London. That's true. And in the same way in what you're doing. You can't just impose your assumptions on them. But there's a next step. You're then, having seen things from their perspective, presumably you're hoping to do something further.
Just to correct me, isn't it the case that the truth in this case is that the psychotherapy works? So there's a community of psychiatrists who agree that this form of psychotherapy is successful and it works. Isn't that?
Yes, and so there is a notion of success, a notion of it works.
The notion that something works, I would have thought is a very scientific notion.
Yes.
If this form of psychotherapy works, it seems to me that's a truth that can be shared in a scientific community. And yes, okay, so yes.
You talk about reason and religion. Where's personal faith in it, as you see it?
I did at one point mention the word faith because I do get concerned nowadays that people think that faith and reason are opposed to each other. Now, it seems to me that faith is an essentially rational process. Now, that doesn't mean you've got to be a philosopher to be a believer, but it means that if you believe in something. And there is, you hope, something that you're believing in. So it isn't just like the Beatles song, all you need is love, all you need is faith. Faith is faith in something, and the question is, well, what is it? It's not enough to say, I've got faith. There are plenty of people in the world who have faith, and they've got faith in pretty rotten things. The Nazis, I suppose, had a form of faith. So what is it you're believing in, and is that belief warranted? And, perhaps you have a strong belief in a revelation, the value of the Bible or something like that. But that ought to be rationally grounded. You ought to have some reasons for why, even if it's something borne out in your own experience. It isn't just blind. So I think that faith is, as I've said, and essentially, that doesn't mean it's cold, it doesn't mean it's impersonal, it doesn't mean that my beliefs, my willingness to risk my life may not go beyond what I can rationally prove. It isn't linking faith only to what can be proved. Faith perhaps can go beyond, but never against reason. But it does suggest that faith has its roots in reason and is not opposed to it. And too many people nowadays, and particularly of course people attacking religion, want to oppose faith and reason. And they try and make out that people who are religious have in a sense given up on their reason. Now what I'm emphasizing is that that should not be the case, and it is not the case. Religion, if it is worth believing in, it should be able to stand up against any kind of reasoning. In a sense, you see, Richard Dawkins doesn't have strong reasons against religious faith. He just defines reason in such a way he doesn't have to. So there is no evidence for religious faith because you won't count as evidence anything that any religious believer brings forth. It's got to be something that can be scientifically proved. And I mean, that's a very extraordinary idea because what can be scientifically proved anyway changes from generation to generation anyway. So it's a very parochial view. I'm not going to believe anything that we here and now as scientists can't prove. And that's very, very limiting.
Yes, sir.
Just going back to what you said at the beginning about yourself and Plato agreeing on the importance of truth and so on. It did occur to me that you and Plato might disagree on how you define what this truth is. And that led me to think about the whole idea of absolutes, and that perhaps if you look at sort of modernist cultural beliefs, you end up with, take the Nazis for an example, with this belief in a set of absolutes that actually lead to a lot of sort of conflict and so on.
Yes.
And that actually you end up perhaps seeing some of postmodernism as a reaction against that kind of sort of totalitarian absolutism, which is defined as truth by those that hold it.
Yes.
Could everyone hear the question at the back? Because it's right at the front, more or less. Do you want to just repeat?
Well, it was about Plato and absolutism, and in fact that postmodernism is a reaction against the absolutism sometimes people see, and totalitarian aspects of that, which of course is a very important point. I think that is actually what's going on. But what I've been arguing about, I mean, I don't think Plato and I would disagree about about the nature of truth. We would disagree about what's true, perhaps. I mean, I'm not going to sign up to his notion of the idea of the forms, of absolute standards, but I would sign up to his view of the objectivity of truth, its independence of our judgment, of human understanding. And that is part of the key here, that objectivity and absolutism are not the same. Now, an absolutism is that this is true, we know it, I'm going to clobber you if you don't accept it. Objectivity is saying, well, there is a truth that's independent of the way we think. And that actually should be a very sobering thing to say, because it may be that even I'm mistaken as well as you. It's a way of actually encouraging us to discuss things and listen to each other, because we might learn from each other as well as teach each other. Now, an absolutist, particularly if we go back to the Nazis, they're sure they're right. Now, I suppose the problem with some people is that they know they're right, they're not going to listen to anybody else, and they may want to impose their views. But you see, there are three stages here. What's true, knowing it's true, and imposing it on other people. And I don't think that one stage follows from another. So I'm, at the moment, arguing that there is such a thing as truth. I don't think I'd want to argue that everything I think I know, I do know. So certainty doesn't imply truth. I mean, putting it the other way, of course, some people get worried here that in the end it begins to encourage a kind of scepticism, that in the end perhaps you can't say anything, certainly. But I think this is where faith comes in. One has to make a stand and say something. You have to live according to some notion of truth. That you have to... I mean, if I go out of the front door, I believe the earth is solid outside me. It's a kind of first-year philosophy point. I don't believe there's going to be a big hole in front of me, but it's conceivable. One opens up and so on. But you can't live like that. You never walk anywhere. So you've got to, in fact, live by certain things, even if you aren't absolutely certain. And I think one of the troubles about philosophy is that it's very often wanted certainty, and when it hasn't got that, it's given up on truth. I think certainty is very hard to obtain, and indeed, of course, the only sort of kind of certainty I think we can get is perhaps in mathematics or geometry. And religion isn't that kind of thing, and nor is science. So you're never going to achieve that kind of logical truth, I think. It's going to be always much less certain. But that doesn't mean it isn't true. It doesn't mean we can't believe it's true. It certainly should believe that we're humble, and it perhaps also should mean, and well, perhaps I shouldn't say perhaps, we shouldn't impose our views on other people. But there is a question about teaching in all of this. There is a question, again, you see, Richard Dawkins says that teaching religion is child abuse. But you've got to teach children something. If you don't teach them religion, that's taking up a stance too. It's showing them something about the irrelevance of religion, perhaps. So I'm afraid that in this world you just have actually to live as if something is true and act accordingly, but at the same time have the humility and willingness to listen to other people. And no one will ever understand the whole truth, so there's always something you can know. And I think that therefore this is where reason is tremendously important. People are very often, of course, afraid of reason. I remember hearing of one woman who said, well, she didn't want to go into the American Natural History Museum because she was afraid it might shake her faith. I think that's a dangerous attitude. If you feel that there's something in science that if you found out about a bit more, it would shake your faith. One's faith ought to face everything and still be able to take it. Yes, well, yes.
Sorry, my question is that in fact in some cases you might need to impose your views on others. For example, you mentioned the bad religion that's child sacrifice or something like that. I mean, we had cases of these very dangerous exorcisms and so on in Britain which amount to child abuse. So,
yes. I think I was thinking about kind of personal imposition, but there we're talking about law and what laws we should have. And I do think that some laws restrict certain kinds of things. We're not going to allow murder, and if it's religiously motivated, that doesn't excuse it. So I think that if we live in a society, we have to decide what kind of society we live in. And indeed, we have to decide the source of the principles which inspire us. I mean, I firmly believe in religious freedom. But actually, I have a very strong suspicion that a belief in religious freedom has Christian roots, and therefore is more likely to flourish in an avowedly Christian society than in a secular society. Now there's a slight dilemma there, because how do we pass on the Christianity whilst respecting the freedom? But if you don't pass it on, I think you might end up with a less free society. It does seem to me that many secular students are far less tolerant than I would hope they would be. They want to, in fact, muzzle certain beliefs. And I think that, therefore, so far from just saying, we disagree with you, they're saying that those beliefs oughtn't to be held. The government ought to do something about it. I mean, let's take creationism now. I mean, that's a very controversial view, and I'm not going to defend it. But on the other hand, you notice that people are very willing to want to actually stop people even expressing the view. And you're getting, therefore, pretty close to an intolerance there. And so what I'm saying is you can get as much intolerance against religion as you've ever had from various kinds of religion.
The question in the back, thank you.
Can relativism in some instances be seen as a response to realizing that someone else has a version of reality that's more true than your own, so it hurts my ego less to say that, oh, it's just true for you and this is true for me and it's all relative anyway. So, for example, Christian thinkers or scholars coming across Islam and saying, gosh, this is at least as rational as my own religion, or perhaps more so, it doesn't have the problem of the Trinity, or it has an intact scripture, or something like that. But it's sort of easier to say, well, okay, that's true and this is true and it's all relative. And it's a reaction to actually realizing, rather than saying I'm wrong and they're right, not necessarily that example, but any example, could that be part of it?
I suppose so, but of course, as you describe it, it's intellectual laziness, isn't it, really? It's a bit like when we were going to the museum. I mean, it's more or less saying, well, rather than give up a doctrine or try and show why it's plausible, I just try and not think of the alternatives. I mean, I'd rather take the line of trying to kind of explain the doctrine of the Trinity. It's not an easy task, but still. Reminds me of my daughter when she was having her confirmation classes, and the canon who was taking the classes said to her, well, I think we're finished now. Is there anything you'd like to ask me? And my daughter said, well, yes. She said, I'm just a bit puzzled about the doctrine of the Trinity. Could you just explain it to me? So it's not an easy doctrine, but to proclaim it and not really believe it, or to think that the alternatives are better, is profoundly irrational.
Yes. Could I put a problem to you? Let me postulate a society somewhere else in the world which has an all-male priesthood supported by slavery, and they engage in child sacrifice, circumcision, they execute homosexuals and adulterers. Now, I would, I think, disagree with them on every one of those points. I'd be against them on every one of those points. But I start from the position that I would not be inclined to send an army in to thump them. I would take the view, which I would not want to describe as relativist. I would just want to take the view that that's a different society, and I would hope that one could persuade them to change their ways eventually. But I have a sort of suspicion that if I actually had at my disposal sufficient power to move in and impose my own views, I might be tempted to do so.
Well, I mean, that's partly the reason. But let's go back to the 19th century when the British Empire did have the power to impose its views, and therefore was there in control of certain situations. Should it have interfered or not on certain occasions? Should it have stopped Hindu widows being thrown on a funeral pyre? It did. I would have said probably it was right to do so. A relativist would have said not. Should it, in South Sea Islands, something like Fiji or Tonga, should they have said actually cannibalism is wrong, we're not going to allow this? Or there actually I think it was more missionaries persuading them actually. It was more effective that way, of course, which again comes back to your point that the most effective way of doing it is by converting the people to another view rather than imposing by force. So if you work through the people, it's far more effective in Fiji and Tonga by making them more Methodist than by actually, just the British Empire, marching in and saying we won't have this. So they actually saw that what they were doing was wrong. That was a very effective and powerful way of doing it. But if you were there and could intervene, should you? And I'd say yes. If we're here, should we go around meddling? Well, I mean, we're back in all the arguments about Iraq and all that kind of thing, aren't we, before long? I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. And I've always, myself, I've been a bit reluctant to think that the way to kind of impose human rights is by going in and imposing them by force, killing people to make them free, so that kind of thing. Still, I don't know. As a practical issue, it's tricky. As a theoretical issue, I think they're wrong and they'd be better without those views.
Okay, quite a few hints. Yes, Claire. Yes.
Well, following on from that, how do we avoid the search for truth degenerating into conflict? It seems to me a lot of the problems in the world at the moment are to do with people who think they have a monopoly of truth.
Yeah. Well, the word is monopoly, of course, and what I was trying to say is that no one has a monopoly on truth, and if you once think that, you're deeply mistaken. So but the opposite is true. If you don't believe in truth, all there is conflict. Because you're not going to just, I don't think human nature being as it is, people will just sit back and say, well, they disagree. I mean, there is a kind of ideology at the moment that says diversity is wonderful, multiculturalism is wonderful, let's celebrate diversity. I don't think that goes down too well with human nature, and I don't think it's a sustainable position for very long. I mean, it's what the government would like at the moment, I think, in schools and elsewhere. But diversity for its own sake is probably difficult to as a policy to continue. But anyway, it just leads you to the question, what's so good about diversity? Why is that better than other? And if you get back into issues about what's true and what is a better kind of society, what fits human nature better, and then we're back into issues of truth. Because I do believe, I mean, and this links on with what Pope said, I do believe very strongly in the importance of human nature. That one of the things, I think we must recognise that one of the things that relativism does isn't just attack the idea of truth or reality. It undermines any notion of being human, because being human is a universal property across time and across space. So Chinese are human, Iraqis are human, the ancient Greeks were human. I mean, somebody like the philosopher Hume in the 18th century understood this, because he said if you want to see how the British and French, or if you want to see how the Greeks and Romans behaved, look at the British and French. In other words, human nature is just the same. It hasn't changed. And we're all human and we can understand each other because of that. Relativism says, oh no, what counts as being human depends on your society. So we're not the same in different places at different times. There aren't needs and interests that are going to be cross-cultural. And a corollary of that is that humans don't matter everywhere, because if they're not human, I mean, you can't abuse human rights, for instance.
It's a question of yes.
I'm not, of course, against the use of reason, but in talking and thinking about it, one should recognise that it isn't always effective. That our powers of reason don't necessarily get us to the right answer.
Oh, yes.
The reason why the people were told not to put their eyes on funeral powers was because presumably we couldn't persuade them not to by reasoning. The reason why your lady won't go into the museum is because she knows there'll be some clever guy who will do some argument that she won't be able to counter.
Yeah.
Reason isn't a failed thing.
No. But what do we do then? Give up on reason?
No,
I mean it's an imperfect instrument, I fully agree.
But I think when one talks about it, one tends to be assuming it's going to get you there. And I think one has to recognise it isn't always.
And we're not all fully rational, and we don't all act on our... I mean, one of the things that the ancient philosophers talked about a lot, and is still very, very true, is the Greek problem of what was called akrasia, weakness of will. We know what's right and we don't do it. Well, that's just common human experience. We have letters and Paul says that. And so again, even if we reason to the right conclusion, we don't necessarily act on it. So I mean, this comes back to human nature and issues about fallibility, dare I say it, even the word sin comes in here. And that's another part of the human condition. And of course, to be fair, that's why a lot of people distrust reason. A lot of the reformers distrusted reason for that reason. Because it can be warped, it can be misused for one's own purposes, reasons can be rationalizations. Reason is very dangerous, and of course it can be a means of setting ourselves up against God. So there are all of these problems. But all I would say is that if the conclusion is, well, therefore, because we can sometimes be irrational, we give up on reason, so we're always going to be irrational, and that doesn't seem to be the right conclusion.
Yes, question today.
At the outset, you mentioned your book about reason and commitment that the Poles were enthusiastic about. I wonder if I could take you back to the commitment end of that. It arises out of a discussion some of us were having over the dinner table last night. When you've been in the classroom with your students, do you assume that rationality is a neutral standpoint or a committed standpoint? How do you handle that?
I assume that reason should be targeted on what's true. So it isn't neutral between truth and falsity, but it isn't necessarily neutral between all the possible views that have been put forward, because some may be right and some may be wrong. If I look out of the window and see the sun shining and say, well, reason is neutral between whether it's raining or the sun shining, and that's obviously mad. Reason, because it's linked with what we believe is true, must in fact be constrained by truth. Now, so reason isn't necessarily neutral. Now, the problem is that everybody will say, in my view, is the right one, so reason's on my side. And that's where certain humility and willingness to listen comes in. But in the end, of course, we have to be committed. And some people, undoubtedly, are committed to very silly things. One reason why I wrote my book, Reason and Commitment, is what sparked it off was I was working in my study one day and the doorbell rang. And I went down and there were two very smart young Americans in dark suits and white shirts, and they were Mormons. And I, perhaps rather foolishly, invited them in. And we had a discussion. And neither of us convinced the other. I think they probably found that they got more of an argument than they bargained for. But even so, I went back afterwards and thought, how can such nice, sensible people believe things that are so totally daft? And I thought, well, they have a very... And also, I thought, if Christians had half the commitment, and I'm deliberately implying Mormons aren't Christians, I'm afraid, wrongly despite that. But nevertheless, if Orthodox Christians had a quarter the commitment that they had, this country would be transformed. So there was something to admire there. And they were nice people as well. So there was something to admire, and yet there was something deeply wrong there, I felt, as well. So I felt, well, the commitment is there, but it's all based on warped reason. So the reason for believing and the commitment are very often sometimes separated, and one can see the why. And indeed, sometimes one can see people who have good reasons for believing what they believe, and then just leave it. They're not committed. And that's probably the story of a lot of the churches in this country nowadays. But so I was taking these two things and thinking, well, how do they fit together? And I realised that a lot of modern philosophy at the time was, in a sense, concentrating on the commitment side of things and not bothering about the rational side of things.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, that's fine. I think that we would like a good break before lunch. The sun is shining. You might want to walk outside. And
it's true that the sun is shining. And it's shining for each of you, no matter what you think.
So
we perceive the sun to be shining.
And you're right to perceive, but you're right to perceive it.
Right. Yeah,
Yes, I mean, I've had arguments with people at the lunch table who said, I said, well, look, it's true that the salt cellar is there, and it's only true that you see that it's there. And that's the first step towards relativism, and it's a very dangerous step, because you're actually not claiming that anything's true for other people, even if they agree with you. And I think if you move back like that to what's just true for the individual or true for the group, then in the end you're losing grip on the world in a dangerous sense.